Ashley. Thanks for that's a good video. It was thoughtful. I appreciate how you wove like in the like attention to both trauma and cultural strengths when talking about the indigenous mental health. It was really good, and it rents. It kind of, I guess you could say, it resonates a lot with the recent literature. Um, I I started digging into it, and one article I found was especially relevant in the systematic review by Hernan and Werner 2022, which examines trauma and substance use among the American Indian Alaska Native individuals. And this article I found, it highlights how trauma and substance abuse, you know, they're often interwoven in like these cycles, and importantly they call attention to those cultural buffers, like spirituality, community involvement, and connection to that cultural identity, as protective factors, if that makes sense. And that's by Heron and Venner 2022. I guess you could say that it reinforces your point about not ignoring strengths and resilience when counseling. And your video was really good. And another recent work that I found that we should probably add in there is the trauma informed care and cultural humanity and mental health context. It was published in the PMC journal, and it argues that, applying trauma informed care in a sensitive way to cultural contexts is, that's especially it's essential, especially for minoritized populations, and that's according to Shim Compton, 2020. It aligns directly with what you said about needing, flexibility, or in that context, and humility as counselors. I think the article points out that I read that trauma informed approaches must go beyond the generic protocols, and they have to be adapted to that socio-cultural meaning and community realities. I think if you combine those, I'd emphasize in counseling with Indigenous clients, when we hear trauma, we must also look for cultural strengths, identity, community, traditional practices, and build those into that healing process. And that's from Heron and Werner, as they suggest. And we must also do the cultural humility, not just cultural competence, but the therapist must be, they have to be willing to adjust and learn, acknowledging the client's worldview, and how they look at things. It must kind of drive how healing is structured, and that's suggested in healing. It's suggested in trauma informed and cultural humility literature. Finally, I when making interventions, you have to integrate culturally these relevant practices, the ceremonies, the land-based healing, the storytelling, which is very, very important to the culture, rather than just imposing that standard Western therapy. I Thanks again, Ashley. It was really mind provoking, thought provoking. You raised critical points. I think your reflections plus, these recent perspectives kind of strengthen how we might ethically and effectively work with our Indigenous clients. I'm going to go ahead. I appreciate it, and my references are Heron and Venner 2022, a systemic review of trauma and substance use in American Indian Alaska Native individuals and incorporating cultural considerations, and then Shim and Compton 2020, trauma informed care and cultural humility and mental health context. Thanks.